Good afternoon in New York and Eastern North America. Good morning, Los Angeles, middle and western parts. Good evening in good evening in the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. And welcome, whatever time of day or night, for all who are joining us from all corners of the world. I am Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. Thank you for joining us, our webinar on the legacies of World War II dead. And forgive me, I should have, let's go ahead. Today's International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma Roundtable webinar is held following May 8 and May 9, the days the United Nations remember the dead of World War II. The one after World War I, which was the war to end all wars. Ended 80 years ago, the Second World War was the largest and deadliest conflict in human history, to never again be repeated. Multinational, multidisciplinary, intergenerational panelists will share, compare, and reflect upon experiences, memories, related developments, and lessons learned, both personally and professionally. They will also discuss how these might help us comprehend our world today and delineate present and future challenges, risks, and hopes. This webinar would not have happened without the help of Dr. Orest Tsuvalo, member of the ICMGLT Ukraine Working Group, and Irina Frankova, its chair. Let me similarly acknowledge the help of Eric Vermeten and Harold Kudler. As always, our deep thanks to our wonderful interpreters, Natalia Zet and Rana Stemkovska, sorry. Your moderator, I am a clinical psychologist, traumatologist, victimologist, and psychohistorian. Having developed the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children in the 1970s, I have devoted much of my career to studying, treating, writing about, and preventing lifelong and multi-generational impacts of massive trauma worldwide, to ensuring victims' rights, the rights of future generations, and to reparative justice. The nuclear version of the Danieli Inventory for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma exists in most of the relevant languages and is currently utilized to assess intergenerational impacts of wars, bombings, other traumas. For me, psychohistory, which is what partly we are doing today, explores history as it is lived today, not only as a series of dates, events, and names, but as it shapes our choices and ways of being now. I will briefly present the different speakers now. I will not do justice to everything because I don't want to take more time than necessary, but we will put in the chat for your information all of their bios. Let me begin with our first presenter from Germany, is Christian Schmal, a professor of psychosomatic medicine and psychotherapy at Heidelberg University and medical director of the Department of Psychosomatic Medicine at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim, Germany. His research focuses on emotional regulation, self-injurious behavior, and dissociation, as well as the interaction of neurobiology and psychotherapy in borderline personality disorder and stress disorder. He has published more than 300 articles, books, and book chapters. Our second presenter from Ukraine is Volodymyr Vyatrovich, a historian, publicist, and politician. As director of the Archives of the Security Service of Ukraine from 2008 to 10, he declassified the KGB archives. He taught at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and the Kiev Molia Academy in Kiev. Headed the Center for Studies of the Liberation Movement. Heading the Institute of National Remembrance in 2014 to 19, Volodymyr was named among the initiators of the package of decommunization laws. He authored and co-authored 15 books on the history of the Ukrainian liberation movement of the 20th century and World War II. Third, from the Netherlands, is Eric Vermetten, a professor of psychiatry and staff psychiatrist at Leiden University Medical Center. He previously served as head of research at the Military Mental Health Service of the Dutch Armed Forces. Internationally recognized for his work on trauma, moral injury, and innovative treatments such as 3-MDR and MDMA, he bridges clinical care, scientific research, and policy, advising at the intersection of psychiatry and security. Fourth, from the United Kingdom, is Sir Simon Wesley. Sir Simon Wesley, FRS, is the Regis Chair of Psychiatry at King's College London and a leading clinical academic with over 1,000 publications. A former president of both the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal Society of Medicine, he founded the King's Centre for Military Health Research and chaired the United Kingdom's independent review for the Mental Health Act. A passionate historian, his family's World War II legacy deeply informs his work and worldview. Rebecca Clifford, also from the United Kingdom, is an award-winning historian specializing in the history of the Second World War, histories of childhood, and oral history. She is professor of European and transnational history at Durham University and holds Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford. She has published extensively, and her works included the 2020 book, Survivors, Children's Lives After the Holocaust. Survivors was winner of several national and international awards, lots of them, almost every award. You will see all of them on the chat. Australia immediately followed the UK, and we have a video from Sandy McFarlane, a founding board member of ICMGLT. An emeritus professor of psychiatry of the University of Adelaide, Sandy is an international expert in the field of the impact of disasters in PTSD. He has received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the International Society for for traumatic stress studies. He has held 2 advisory roles to the Australian Defence Forces and the Department of Veterans Affairs. He is a retired group captain of the RAF Specialist Service. He has published 480 articles in chapters and co-edited 3 books. Seventh is Japanese Shigeyuki Mori. And Mori, I'm so sorry I didn't say good morning to you. It's hard to call it a morning where you are. But you're our hero for speaking to us in the middle of your night. Licensed clinical psychologist born in Kobe, Japan in 1955, has finished the academic course at Kyoto University. An emeritus professor of Konan University after mandatory retirement in 2023, he has been involved in trauma studies after the great earthquake that hit his hometown, Kobe, in 1995, and joined the Japanese Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Along with the work on other traumatic events, he was also involved in research and meetings on World War II. Then the United States joined the war. And our eighth speaker is Dr. Brian Engdahl, adjunct professor in the Psychology and Neuroscience departments at the University of Minnesota, also holding the Anderson Chair in PTSD Research and Treatment, whose clinical and research work as a psychologist at the Minneapolis Veterans Affairs Medical Center for 42 years focused on World War II combat veterans, POWs, and the combat injuries sustained by veterans of all eras. With over 100 national and international publications and presentations, mostly on PTSD, he's currently studying veterans' overall health. His father served for nearly 4 years at sea in the United States Navy during World War II. Ninth is Dr. Harold Kudlow. Dr. Kudlow served as the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Board of Directors, co-led development of joint VA Department of Defense guidelines for post-traumatic stress, and advised a Sesame Street series for military families. He was national lead for VA mental health policy from 2014 to 18 and continues to play a leadership role in a number of mental health organizations, including the International Center for Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma. Last but not least is Jennifer Trahan, a leading expert in international criminal law and human rights, member of the Advisory Council of the ICMGLT. Jennifer serves as convener at the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression, a clinical professor at NYU Center for Global Affairs. She directs the concentration in international law and human rights, and advises global institutions on atrocity prevention, accountability, and prosecution of the crime of aggression. We have 2 hours for the webinar, though we have been known for a most engaged audience who keeps us longer. Following taking a deep breath after the presentations, each one would be around 5 to 6 minutes. there will be a dialogue or interchange among us. I will then open the floor to questions and brief comments from the virtual audience, which also has a few surprises. We will then conclude with last words. Please use the Q&A or the chat function, and we will do our best to respond to as many questions and brief comments as we can during the question and answer period. Feel free to direct your question to a particular panelist or to the full panel. I now have the great honor of introducing our first speaker, Christian Schmal. Christian, the floor or the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Yael, for inviting me, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. And as you mentioned, I'm the first speaker, and I come from Germany, the land which started World War II and was responsible for a lot of suffering worldwide, and was the land where much more perpetrators than victims lived during this time. I'm not a historian, I'm a psychiatrist, as mentioned, but I have a strong personal interest in history, and particularly in German history of the 20th century, and how this is related to today's political and psychological situation in our country, but also around the world. That's what you called psychohistory. You asked us to give us a little bit of a personal insight. I know that, like most or nearly all German families, we have a war history. Everyone has persons, relatives, ancestors who were involved in the war, and I have two grandfathers who were soldiers in the Second World War, and my father-in-law, my grandfather-in-law, who died during the war. But I remember only a few war stories that were transmitted, and also asking my parents. I never got much information, and it's too bad. I personally think it's too bad that no one wrote these personal histories down. So I have most of what I know is from books and other literature. So from a professional point of view, I think German history in psychiatry and psychotherapy is very interesting after the war. On the one hand, there was unfortunately a lot of too much continuity after the war. Even psychiatrists that were involved in the T4 action, meaning killing disabled and psychiatrically ill patients, were back in their leading positions, university chair positions, for example. And it took very long until this terrible history was brought to attention and was documented. And here the German Association of Psychiatry did a very important but very late job with editing a book and organizing exhibitions. And I know that Simon was also involved in getting that to the Great Britain, which I think is a very, very great endeavor. Interestingly, and that's how I came in touch with Eric about this topic, in the 1960s already, the former and founding director of our institute, the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim, was very active in evaluating victims of the Nazi regime that seeked financial recompensation. And he assessed various mental problems in hundreds of concentration camp survivors from different backgrounds, Jewish persons, communists, and others. I wasn't aware of that until Eric brought this to my attention, and he was interested in, or is interested in, similar evaluations in the Netherlands. Interesting, that was a time when PTSD was not yet a formal diagnosis, so he came up with, there were a lot of other interesting evaluations there. Other than in the US, PTSD in Germany was supposed to be mostly related to civilian trauma. This, you can also say, this is somehow related to some kind of suppression. It changed dramatically after the wars in the 1990s, when Germany was first involved after the Second World War, the Yugoslavia wars, Afghanistan. Only after that, war-related PTSD became a topic in Germany and is still very much. So what lessons can you say I don't know if we as Germans have learned lessons, but it has changed, of course, a lot. Germany has become, I think, similar to Japan, a relatively pacifistic country. For example, I still remember the movement against nuclear weapons in the 1980s, millions of people protesting against, or there was a pausing of conscription for the army in 2011, and this is now discussed how to change that again. So I have to say that Russia's aggression against Ukraine 3 years ago caught us in Germany very much by surprise. And a lot of people have thought about it, and I personally think that German history, with all its dark sides, can't leave us on an island of only self-reflection, but obligates us to be very watchful and responsible, not only in Europe, but worldwide. And our head of state, German's federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, in commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, made some important points in his speech, and I want to just highlight three points here. He highlighted that of course, all Germans have somehow been involved, and it's not the Nazis on the one side and the Germans on the other side, as a long splitting of these groups, if you will, that was part of our treating history. This needs to be changed. He also made a very important point that, of course, the memories of World War II are terrible, but that they are not a mere burden, but he called it a valuable wealth of experience that can be used for understanding and current situations in other countries or other wars, and particularly now at these increasing times of atrocities, to end memorizing World War II and the cruelties of the Nazi regime is definitely no option. And if you are looking at the Russian war against Ukraine, of course, on the one hand, Soviet Russia in 1945 was part of liberating Germany, besides the US, England, and France. But it's very disgusting to see how Putin now abuses this end of World War II to glorify his aggression against Ukraine. That's my personal point of view here. And with this, I want to stop and hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Christian, for the width and depth of your of your contribution. It's a very good start to the discussion. I'm deeply honored and expect with the same excitement Volodymyr's contribution. Please, those of you who haven't done so and need the Ukrainian English interpretation, go to interpretation and click English and choose whether you want the voice muted or not. Volodymyr, I'm so glad to have you with us. The screen is yours.
Thank you for being invited for this extremely interesting webinar. And I would like to tell you about my personal experience. The matter is that every family in Ukraine has family reminiscences about the World War II. I come from the western part of Ukraine, and this is the part of Ukraine which has the most difficult experience of the World War II. Up to 1939, this territory was occupied by Poland. After the beginning of the World War II, it has been captured by the Soviet Union. And in 2 years, in 1941, the Germans attacked this territory. And in 1944, the Soviet power came back. And this is a difficult history of this area. And if we talk about my family, I would like to start from the following. Well, my brother and my grandma thought that his son was killed during the World War II, and there was no information about him until 1943. When I was a student of history, I found his story. It was a German document which actually read that the members of the national partisans were hung in the Drohobych in 1942. In 1943, the other members of my family, two brothers of my grandfather, has joined the German troops of Halachina division. In 1943, a lot of Ukrainians from Western Ukraine were joining these troops of Germany because they were afraid that the Soviet government will come back, because they remembered the awful atrocities they carried out in 1939. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were victims of those atrocities. And at that time, my grandfather in 1943 was mobilized to the Red Army, to the Soviet Army, and he was a machine gunner, and he was fighting Japan in the Far East. And he's never seen his brothers, and his brothers after the World War II found themselves in France, and for some period of time they were exchanging letters, but it was very dangerous to get the letters from abroad. And my grandfather stopped communicating with them, and they died without communicating with each other. This is a dramatic story of one of the Ukrainian families. And if we are talking about my professional interest in the World War II. As it was mentioned in the presentation, I work on the history of the Ukrainian liberation movement, and I am studying the history of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which was anti-Nazi movement at first, and then this struggle continued, and they started to fight the Soviet government for the next 10 years after the completion of the World War II. And this is also a very dramatic page of our history. And if we are talking about the lessons learned from the war for the Ukrainians and by the Ukrainians, we have to understand that the war affects any nation which participates in it. But the most awful for the people who have no state of their own. And Ukraine was one of the main territories where the World War II was evolving. And it did not have any own army, which would be able to protect Ukrainians. And Ukrainians were those who were fighting in all the armies of all the peoples who lived in the Ukrainian territory. The German army, the Soviet army, and other armies which were fighting in the Ukrainian territory, including the Ukrainian insurgent army. And the Ukrainians in the Red Army were fighting the Ukrainians who were fighting in the German army, and they were shooting each other because they belonged to opposite armies. And the losses of Ukraine in the World War were huge, and this is one of the huge tragedies in our history. It's from 8 to 10 million of people killed, and the majority of these dead are not the military men. 6 million of civil citizens were killed, and these are the losses of Ukraine in the World War II among the civil population. And as of, well, the current events, it is very important for us to actually assess these events. And a lot of changes come about in the Ukrainian society about the understanding of the World War II. During the Soviet times, the World War II was represented as a heroic page, the triumph, the victory in the absolutely militaristic spirit. And this tradition of looking at the World War II was preserved even after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And only after the beginning of the war with Russia, the people started to understand it differently. And the majority of the Ukrainians start to understand how many lies have been told by the Soviet propaganda to the Ukrainians about this war. The main understanding, which comes to a lot of Ukrainians, is the war is not a triumph, it's an awful tragedy, which actually affects everyone. And what it gives us, how the World War II gives us an ability to understand the current situation. Because of the war which is going on at present, and I am now not far away from Bucha, which was the place of awful atrocities of the Russian army, not far from Kiev. And because of this war which is ongoing, a lot of Ukrainians understood that in reality, we have not really left behind all the awful atrocity which we thought were the legacy of the 20th century. Unfortunately, we saw that the same crimes are possible to commit in the 21st century, though we thought that they are back to the 20th century. The extermination of the civil population, extermination of the cities, and raids over the cities of Ukraine. And this is a reality of these times in Ukraine. And a lot of Ukrainians during this war understood how important it is to have their own state and to have their own army. And thanks to the support of our international friends, we have now our own army, which is protecting the Ukrainians at present. And at the personal level, I would like to say the following. The majority of Ukrainians during this war, and we live in the extreme conditions, when uh, uh, going to bed every night, we are not sure that we are going to wake up in the morning because there is no specific touchline, and the territory is raided all over Ukraine. And we quite often think that the missile might hit our own city and our own home. And in spite of all this, people understand the value of life at present, and they understand that it is necessary to really feel this life. And we actually live through the cultural explosion in Ukraine, I would say. We can see that a lot of very interesting theater performances are being carried out. It is impossible even to buy a ticket on the spur of the moment to the theater. It is necessary to book them ahead of time because people would like to to have a test of life apart from the war. When as a historian, I was researching the World War II, I thought that the war really pushes out all these aspects of our life, except for the hostilities but the ability to survive. But people would like to feel a different part of this life, and people are looking for that, even in spite of the fact that the war is outraging in the country, and they are not ready to forget about it. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. You're a historian, and you're pointing to some of the complexity of the trauma field about about trauma, resilience, traumatic growth, etc. Eric, Simon, you have your hand up. Is that it's?
No, sorry.
No problem, no problem.
Trying to change the interpretation back to.
Okay, I just want to be polite. Eric, we are back to.
Sure.
We are back to Central Europe.
Central Europe in the Netherlands. Thank you for organizing this, Yael. Most wonderfully done, and so good to see colleagues and friends present here at the panel. Now, I will speak for about 6 minutes in four different chapters, and I will not speak about the asylum of Kaiser Wilhelm that was given by the Netherlands in 1918, and he died in 1942. I just remember that. I'll skip that. That's a very interesting historical piece. No, I will speak from a Dutch perspective. It's a country that lived under 5 years of occupation that was shaped by repression, deportation, hunger, and loss. Let me give you some numbers. During World War II, the Netherlands lost approximately 250,000 people, a staggering toll for a small nation. The largest group victims was Dutch Jews, with around 102,000 murdered in the Holocaust, many in Sobibor. Over 75% of the pre-war Jewish population, one of the highest death rates in Western Europe. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 non-Jewish civilians died from bombings, executions, or starvation, particularly due to the hunger winter of 1944-1945. Around 17,000 Dutch soldiers and mariners lost their lives while in the former colony of the Dutch East Indies, and another 25,000 to 30,000 Dutch nationals died during Japanese occupation and its aftermath. These numbers reflect not only the direct impact of violence, but also the long shadow of systemic persecution, forced silence, and unacknowledged suffering. The Netherlands remembers the war on May 4 and May 5, not only through grand commemorations, but also in the many absences that followed. Families torn apart, entire neighborhoods emptied, names etched into walls and memorial stones. Yet for decades, much of the suffering remained unspoken. One of the pivotal moments in post-war Dutch memory came not during the war, but in the debate over what to do with the Drie van Breda, the three from Breda, Auster, Funten, Kotella, and Fischer, high-ranking Nazi war criminals imprisoned in the Netherlands. I was born in 1961 in Breda, and I played the flute in a church choir. And I remember two of them were still present at the last rouse during the Mass, where I played my flute. When the question arose in 1972 whether they should be released, the Dutch society had to confront the unresolved pain of survivors and the silence that endured for so long. Yeah. It became evident then how many people still carried trauma that had never been given language, let alone recognition. The voices of survivors, of resistance fighters, of those who had lost everything, were too long internalized, held in bodies, in families, but rarely spoken in public. That silence shaped a generation. As a psychiatrist and a trauma researcher, I have worked with survivors of war, persecution, and displacement. We know in the Netherlands the story of Anne Frank. She became the most recognizable Dutch victim of the Holocaust, putting a personal adolescent face to the immense suffering of the 102,000 Dutch Jews who were murdered. Her story helped the post-war silence about Jewish persecution and the complicity of passivity of many Dutch citizens during occupation. The Anne Frank House, established in 1960 at her hiding place in Amsterdam, has become a powerful site of education and remembrance, visited by over 1 million people annually. She contributed to a moral reckoning in Dutch society. Her voice, preserved through her diary, stood in contrast to decades of societal silence and inadequate recognition of survivor trauma. But also the NOID, Etty Hillesum, Center 45, Luc de Jong, a historian and public intellectual. De Jong authored the monumental multi-volume history of the Netherlands during World War II, Het Koninkrijk der Nederlanden in de Tweede Wereldoorlog. The Netherlands also had its own early pioneers in trauma care, such as Jan Bastiaans, who tried, sometimes controversially, to reach survivors who had no words for what they had endured. His work brought structural understanding of collaboration, resistance, and persecution to the public sphere and shaped Dutch post-war memory culture. Just last week, a new book was published about this work on KZ, the concentration camp syndrome, the use of LSD, and mental liberation. It was co-authored by Leo van Bergen and myself. Yet for many, the trauma of war was not treated, but endured. It was only decades later that a more open national conversation about psychological wounds began, leading to more systematic care and eventually a more decisive international role for the Netherlands in peacekeeping and justice. The legacy of war is deeply embedded in our institutions in the Netherlands, from the annual May commemorations to our legal contributions in The Hague. But the more moral and psychological legacy is still evolving. The Netherlands holds a prominent position of global trauma and PTSD research. When adjusted for population size, the Netherlands ranks second globally, following Israel. This strong standing is attributed to several factors, including the experience of World War II, our social cohesion, and a cultural openness that reduces stigma around discussing trauma. A country that is 2/3 below sea level is always vigilant and under threat of the water. And lastly, the Netherlands has built a robust infrastructure for trauma research. Now, what are the lessons that we learned from the dead? The Dutch experience of World War II is marked by a tension between pride and pain. Pride in acts of resistance, but pain in how many were left undefended, how high the deportation rate was, and how long it took for many stories to be heard. Our post-war identity stressed peace, neutrality, and international law, and yet real peace begins with listening. It took decades before we fully understood that silence is not healing and that trauma unspoken often becomes trauma repeated. The psychological wounds of war did not end in 1945. They were carried, often silently, into the next generations, shaping family dynamics, identities, and national memory. Only in recent decades have we begun to see how intergenerational trauma can echo across time, demanding not only remembrance, but meaningful recognition and repair. The war in Ukraine, Gaza, and broader shifts in Europe have reminded us again that remembrance is not static. Memory must evolve into responsibility, not only for the past, but also present choices. And I'll close. As we mark the 80 years since the liberation of the Netherlands, we do so with humility. The lessons of the war are not frozen in history, they demand continuous reflection. And we remember not only what was done, but also what was not said. In doing so, we give a voice to those who we never heard. And we reaffirm that remembrance is not only about looking back, but also about choosing who we want to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for, again, for giving the global picture. Thank you for acknowledging Anne Frank, who in June 2012 would have been 106 years old. As you remember from our world meeting in Holland, we began the meeting on June 12, and I spoke about that.
You did very well.
I very warmly remember the Queen
Juliana at the time.
crying when I spoke about that. And thank you for, again, like others, pointing out the importance of the conspiracy of silence. Some of you, what I call the conspiracy of silence in my writings, some of you may remember that when I approached the field in the 60s, that was the first thing I met with, silence. And that was what led me to everything I've done for so many years. So thank you for reminding us the connection between knowledge and responsibility and our commitment to future generations and to the rights of future generations.
Yeah.
Robbie, we would now go to no, let's first go to England, because I think Australia joined after in response to England.
Be careful about that.
So Sir Simon Wesley, Simon, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much. Yes, I think Australia would possibly take issue with you on on that particular bit of history, but fortunately Stanley's not here to defend that. So I was born in 1956, the year in which rationing finally ended, actually. So the traces of the war went on for a long time, and grew up in the swinging 60s, although there wasn't a lot of that in Sheffield, where I was born. Though, like Eric, I also played the flute in bands and orchestras. I never knew you did that, Eric. So here we are. We have a lot in common. But the shadow of kind of World War II did hang over my child and adult life, and indeed is probably the reason for what I have as a semi-obsession with history, and that worst of things, an amateur historian and a professional doctor. Although that's better than being the other way around, in which case, if you're a professional historian and amateur doctor, you go to jail. So that's a bit better than that. But nevertheless, World War II could easily have started in 1938, actually, had Britain and France gone to the aid of Czechoslovakia. But as our Prime Minister said at the time, it was a faraway country of which we know nothing. But I know a lot about it because it was the birthplace of my father, who was born and brought up in Prague. And indeed, on the 15th of March, 1939, when the German army marched into Prague, my father slipped away from the family and went to the square at Hradčany and actually saw Hitler on the balcony of the castle And when he went home, his mother slapped him because she was so terrified by what he'd done. Now, my father obviously survived. He was on a kinder transport arranged by a man called Nicholas Winton, who's now very well known in Czechoslovakia and Great Britain, one of 600 children whose lives he saved. And he came to England in August 1939, fortunate indeed. The rest of his family were obviously not, 3 years in Terezin, and then murdered in Auschwitz in September 1943. But my father obviously is not a Holocaust survivor, but he was a child refugee. And on his 18th birthday, he joined the Royal Navy and indeed did then experience genuine trauma. He was sunk twice, but he was saved because his job was in signals, because he spoke perfect German and would listen to German ship-to-shore transmissions. And so when his ship was hit by a torpedo and rolled over, he climbed onto the hull with 20 others, spent the night in the North Sea, whilst the ship slowly settled and most of the others drowned. He was then saved, but he had lost all his hair by his 18th birthday, or not soon after his 18th birthday. But he had nightmares about that for the rest of his life. But I have to say, he did not have PTSD. He was a bit stubborn, I have to say that, and not always the life and soul of the party, but he didn't have a psychiatric disorder. He had a bad war, which he would never forget. And I'm always evangelical about pointing out, that shell shock, which I've written about and studied over the years, is not the same as PTSD, and having a bad war does not mean PTSD. These are different things, and it's rather important that we keep those distinctions. But anyway, for me, World War II then overshadows my life, and I'm intimately connected and fascinated by, Middle Europa, and the history outlined by Vladimir is not unknown to me. However, it is probably unknown to most of my compatriots in the UK, and the same is not true of most of us Brits. World War II is not our obsession. I've given talks often in Germany on why are the British still obsessed with the First World War, which they most definitely are, unlike, I would say, any other country except possibly Australia and New Zealand. And I'll just point out why that might be, because we're talking here about, the dead and the memories of war. But, we, between 2014 and 2018, were almost in an orgy of remembrance and commemoration. Hardly a day would go by. In fact, a day did not go by, because the BBC ran a kind of news broadcast every single day from 2014 to 2019, using modern news readers to recreate the events of that day 100 years before. And that was merely the tip of the iceberg of a huge national, every school was involved, everything was involved in this for the whole of the 4 years. Russia had a greater war than dead than we did, had probably, I think it renovated one war cemetery. Italy did very, very little. I would say, honest reflections to Harold, most Americans may not be quite sure that they served in the First World War, and certainly wouldn't know why. Pearl Harbor, oh my God, that's different. D-Day, that's completely different. But for us, no, it is for us very different, because for most of the world that took place in the World War I, it is seen as the first act of the main drama of the 20th century, a curtain up, as it were, for something far worse. We've already heard from Vladimir what was far worse: totalitarianism, National Socialism, fascism, communism, the NKVD, Gestapo, Stasi, defeat, occupation, collaboration, and the shadow of genocide, much of which passed Britain by. And for us, it was one of the few countries, in fact, where the death toll was far, far higher, 3 times that of the Second World War. And for us, art, society, politics, women getting the vote, economics, literature, everything changes after World War I, not World War II. And in particular, Remembering the Dead, which is the title of this seminar, in Britain is kind of sorted out in 1819. Everything that we do for commemoration is set out as it is in Australia. Then the 2-minute silence, the unknown warrior, the poetry, the music, the 11th hour of the 11th day. You celebrate or commemorate it, you said, in May, Eric. For us, it will always be November the 11th. There's no way that can possibly change. And in particular, the way in which death and remembrance changes. World War I for us democratizes death. Everybody is now identified if possible, or if not, still gets buried, which in the past didn't happen. We have no idea where the dead of Waterloo are, literally no idea. We think they were probably all dug up and used for fertilizer. That did not happen after World War II. And what we have in a stroke of aesthetic brilliance, and it really is we have a completely different way of commemoration. The British war cemeteries developed the Lutyens, the architect, designs a kind of stele, which is a tablet basically, and in which the brilliance of that, which I think will never change, is that for the first time, every single dead are the same. The tablet is the same, regardless of rank. There's no indication of rank except inscribed into it, nation or religion. All of these are unified and united. When you read it, you can see if there is a name, there isn't, but to the naked eye, they look the same. No other war cemeteries do that. It is brilliant. And Kipling's epitaph that goes on all of those who are not known, the unknown, and again, brilliance. It is one of the most beautiful things in the English language. He writes, and it's on every grave, unidentified, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. And again, it's something that for us will never change. And World War II merely used the same rights, remembrance, commemoration, etc., etc. And it's for that reason, as I had to explain to a German audience, which found it a bit difficult, the most famous comedy moment or the most famous TV moment in our history is the last episode of a comedy show called Blackadder, which is always chosen as our favorite TV moment. And it is the end and the death of all the protagonists in the previous six episodes of comedy. And many audiences say, well, how can that be your favorite moment? But it is, and you just have to watch it to understand. So, on the other hand, I do accept when it comes to the history of psychology, psychiatry, although we owe forward psychiatry and crisis intervention to the First World War, modern psychiatry, it would take World War II before we finally had group psychotherapy, screening, complete rethink of combat motivation, breakdown, etc. And of course, inevitably, the arrival of PTSD, which, as I say, is not the same as shell shock. So, we end up then, for us and most of the Western NATO nations, the post-war years, we know, and I've been this advisor in psychiatry of the British Army for now 25 years, we continue to fight what were largely wars of choice. We didn't have to fight them, fought by small professional armies, not conscripts, and never on our national soil. Obviously not the case for Poland, Ukraine, 1945 to 50, former Yugoslavia, and now Ukraine itself. So the challenge we have today is, for the first time in decades, to think about how will we cope if we have to fight again with a conscript army and in a war of survival. And I don't think we yet have any idea how that will happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. We're supposed to have a dialogue after all of your contributions, but each one of your contributions deserves at least an hour or 12 hours of dialogue in itself. So
we can't do that. I'm off to watch football later on.
Immediately suggest to the audience, to all of us, to keep repeating listening to this. A great deal of wisdom. And we have, we also have another United Kingdom expert, Rebecca. Please, the floor is yours. And I don't hear you.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, Rebecca, does everybody hear her? Because I don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So my hearing is again. Okay, go ahead, Rebecca. Don't let me interrupt. I will try my best to do something technical. Okay.
As it were. Yael asked us to reflect on
what the dead of the war mean to us personally and professionally, and lessons learned. And I can tell you a little bit about what it means to me personally and professionally. In terms of how it affects me personally, more than 200 members of my family were murdered in the war. So it's very, very long-lasting, tangible effects on my family. But of course, I was born 30 years after the war ended. So it is a familial effect that kind of permutates everything about the atmosphere, the household I grew up in, and the way it was like to be raised in a family like that. And I think very much about how, if the war had not happened, my family probably never would have left Central Europe. And so it's as if there is another me, right? Of course, who could have been speaking a different language in a different nation with different emotions and different culture. And all of that was lost and something else was gained. Indeed, if it hadn't been for the war, I suppose really I wouldn't exist at all, because my Hungarian mother had to leave Hungary, move to Canada, and meet my Canadian father for me to be in front of you at all right now. So it is deeply enmeshed in everything about my own personal history. And professionally, it is also fundamental to what I do. I've taught the history of the Second World War for 20 years. I write about it, I teach about it, I think about it all the time. I often sometimes feel that I partly live in the past, which is something that I think is true of many historians. But when we were asked to think about lessons learned, I have to admit I sort of paused, because I suppose I'm playing devil's advocate a bit, but I thought, what about lessons we really haven't learned? And also lessons that took so long. Why did they take so long? And actually, almost all of our panelists so far have touched on a little bit the history of the emergence of notions about trauma, the concept of PTSD. And you've talked a little bit about the timing right there, that actually this first emerges only in the 1960s, and then it hits a kind of little bit of a wave in the 70s, and PTSD only enters the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatry in 1980. But no one has actually said too much about why they think it took so long. And I suppose that as a historian, that is what I think about. I think about what is historically contingent about that process, right? And why does it take so long? And I would just add that, looking at it as a historian, I see the political reasons why sometimes these lessons had a very long, slow trickle down. The effect of the Cold War was massive in this sense, in terms of shutting down dialogue in many cases, because it locked us geopolitically into new relationships where it was important not to embarrass our allies, in particular West Germany. And actually, looking to Japan, it was also true of Japan. So we had political reasons to not embrace a kind of deep sort of retrospective looking at the past in 1945, and that lasted for a terribly long time. In fact, in my field, we often find some of the kind of real explosion of scholarship about memory of the Second World War, certainly around the Holocaust. It doesn't come out until 1990s, or the late 1980s, mid to late 1990s, 50 years after the war's end. I feel like we've had some, maybe we can call them lessons learned, we've had some deeper reflections since the 1990s through to the present. That's only 30 years. And I have to admit now, and I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but I do have a deep feeling of that tide turning as well. That it was a 30-year interregnum, that is a moment that is passing. And I cannot help but feel it in this sort of wave of 80th anniversaries that has happened recently, that there's a lot of lip service, but also a real willingness emotionally to turn away from what we might have once called lessons learned. And it worries me very much. So I will leave it at that. Wanted to start talking about the whole history of the evolution of the concept of trauma, but we will be here all day if I start doing that. But it is in my book. in part. And it's also in the book I'm working on now, which is actually about Anna Freud and her relationship to the an evolution of ideas about trauma and resilience in children. So maybe we can return to that when it's time for a dialogue. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. We will now move to Sandy McFarlane's on video. Robbie?
Hi, I'm Sandy McFarlane from Australia. Now, you might ask, why is an Australian talking about World War II? We're in the Southern Hemisphere and seemingly devoid of involvement in the conflicts of Europe and Asia. However, Australia at the time of World War II was a country of 7 million people and finished up with 1 million being in uniform because we were involved in both the European theatre of war because of our allegiance with the British Empire, and also were subject to attack from Japan in the Pacific. This took a tremendous toll. Darwin, the capital of the Northern Territory, received greater bombardment than Pearl Harbor. There were many other settlements along the north coast of Australia that were impacted, and many submarines got into Sydney Harbour and sunk 2 ships. So that was a very direct sense of threat. After the war, Australia was very much drawn into the US political and military sphere, which led to us sending soldiers to Vietnam, for example, where we lost over 500 service personnel. At a family level, my mother, who had studied microbiology at university, worked in the largest hospital in the Southern Hemisphere, which was set up in Sydney to deal with the anticipated mass casualties from that conflict. And my uncle was a submariner in the North Atlantic. So I very much knew that world from my family. Also, as a psychiatrist, I'd treated World War II veterans and also refugees from Eastern Europe who had suffered terribly, including in the concentration camps. So I knew that world firsthand from their experience. But Australia changed in a very different way in the aftermath of the war because of migration. Previously, we'd been a country that had taken largely British migrants. But after the war, we opened our doors to an enormous influx of refugees. We took 182,000 people from displacement camps. 40% of them were Poles. We took 10 times per capita more, for example, than the US. We finished up with a population where in 1966, we had 1 in 5 of our population were refugees. Melbourne was the second largest Greek-speaking city in the world after Athens. Who would have anticipated that? 127,000 Jews, more than 60% of them being survivors of the Holocaust, also came to Australia. And this had a profound impact on the social dynamics of this country. They brought those memories, and it was a profound shift in our culture. Those intergenerational memories were carried, but generally speaking, there was very little public discussion of them in the first years after the war. In fact, there was an intolerance of the suffering of soldiers. There was a famous play produced called One Day in the Year, published in 1958, where the son of a World War II veteran wrote a disparaging article in a university newspaper about his father's behaviour on Remembrance Day, and also was disparaging of the World War I veterans. It was almost as though their suffering was seen as to be beyond contempt because of their silence about it. In recent times, there has been a significant shift, and I think there have been several dynamics. Firstly, Australia sent peacekeeping troops to East Timor and Bougainville. These were both places where we'd been involved in major conflicts in World War II. Secondly, the whole dynamic of the Middle East has impacted on Australia. We've sent troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. And many people wouldn't know that Australians were amongst the troops that liberated Jerusalem from the Ottomans in World War I. They were back again in World War II in Lebanon and also in Iraq. So we have a long history of involvement. And we also have refugees from Iraq and Egypt in Australia. And it's interesting in the world of identity politics how those traumas are now very actively spoken of, and there has been a loss of tolerance between social groups about the shared horrors of war. And so I think we face a number of challenges really about how to face the legacies of World War II in the current era. I think what's critical, though, is that we remember these lessons of history and how we have been able to survive and live in a collaborative way, and that understanding trauma shouldn't lead us to retreat into our own ethnic groups, but rather to have a more general empathy and understanding of the horrors which wars bring. And it's basically about how can we prevent these terrible tragedies happening again in the future.
I will put two other related comments of Sandy's in the chat. Ravi, please add those. Maury, you've been amazingly patient, and we all appreciate that it's the middle of your night.
Okay.
Please join us. Yes.
Thank you for inviting me to this important round table. And maybe I was the last person who joined this group, and I was quite surprised that I was invited to this group, and my English is not so good enough comparing with the other English-speaking countries people, but I do my best. And actually, I have written Rebecca Crayford's book on the youngest children survivors from Holocaust recently for a Japanese journal, and so I knew her from the book and quite interested in that content. And personal history, I had a deep interest in the war already in my childhood. When I was young, I was always occupied by idea about the war, but it's not from my family history. Comparing with other presenters today, my family was not connected to the war directly. As a soldier or as a victims of atomic bomb or the bombing of big cities, they lived in Kyoto City. Kyoto City was never bombed by America because it was very precious for the historically. Kyoto was quite important, and it was protected by America during the war until the end of the war. So they were rather safe during the war. So I was always curious why I was so interested in the war. Maybe, but information on the war was surrounding my childhood everywhere in Japan, because it was I was born only 10 years after the end of the war. And so the many books and cartoons and TV series and anime were about war. And I was already got interested in that content, and always imagining what happened during the war in Japan and outside Japan in the world. Maybe that childhood brought me to today's participation to this group. And afterwards, recently I edited with my group a volume on Japanese anime about the war, and it revealed that the many Japanese manga anime series stories for children in post-war era have been presenting war images, war experiences, and in a way, they were born from the war experience of Japan. And it was quite fascinating for our group. And perhaps I may add that photos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims also had a big impact on my interest in the war. It's quite common experience for Japanese children because they learn about Hiroshima and Nagasaki in school, and the teacher shows some pictures and some documents on the atomic bomb, and they were shocked and sometimes traumatized. And some children start avoiding that kind of story, and some children got into the image of the atomic bomb and cannot escape from the images and nightmares. And that kind of thing happens even today. And I was the same type of child when I was young. And professionally, I became involved in the subject of trauma as a psychologist and a psychoanalytic psychotherapist only after a big earthquake that hit my hometown, Kobe, in 1995. This big earthquake is not the Fukushima incident, but the 20 years before that. And after some years involvement in trauma study, I conducted interview on childhood war experiences in Japan in collaboration with the German German psychoanalyst and psychologist group mainly in Munich, and have been writing articles on the research and about the war from them, which integrated my old interests in the war with my professional task. And recently I have participated in the planning group for a series of interdisciplinary symposia on World War II, World War II that have been held since 2019, interacting with researchers and practitioners in various fields. The symposia has provided me with the opportunity to significantly expand my knowledge and perspective on war. Our group members and me are envisioning the plan to expand our project to all the Asian area and international community. This is a group with not only psychologists and psychiatrists, but also historian, anthropologists and novelists and artists, or professionals from all the field of arts and literature and science, and quite interesting. And we are continuing that project from now on more. The war dead, the topic of today, the treatment of war dead in Japan has been a big issue in the entire course of Japanese warfare. When it became impossible for Japanese government to bury the war dead with respect, and bury the war dead with respect is a policy according to the Geneva Conventions. But the Japanese government was not able to follow the policy anymore. The process of delivering empty bone box to their families eventually took place and even continued for a certain period after the war. But after some years, remains recovery project was inaugurated. Firstly, in 1950s, the later 1960s, we inaugurated again, yeah? And pushed by voices of bereaved families. The project was brought by the responsibility of the government. After then, the treatment of overseas remains has taken a complicated course until today without completed, and sometimes affecting international relations with Asian countries that became battlegrounds. Because some Japanese family members visit South Islands of Asian countries and try to find their parents and their father's bone or their grandfather's bones remaining over the bones, but the citizens of that island, it's quite strange for them, yeah, sometimes. The impossibility of burying the dead was a result of problematic Japanese military strategy itself and of the decision-making that failed to bring the war to an early end. It was followed by the lack of a national mourning system for the war dead. The impossibility of mourning, it's the word originated from German, yeah, in Germany, became one of the characteristics of Japan's post-war society. When we think of Japanese war dead, we cannot help but think of several examples of extreme forms of death. For example, the death by atomic bombs or kamikaze, or death caused by atrocities committed by Japanese army, like Nanking massacre. So the post-war Japanese government tried to integrate Japanese society by demanding hundreds of millions repentance, which means all people need to be repentant, yeah? Avoiding and have a war responsibility. The bipolar identification with the both ends of perpetrator-victim axis split Japanese society and people, and resulting in numbing, avoidance, and turning blind eyes within families, societies, nations as a whole, and of course, within individual personality, which result in today's situation of the difficulty of Japanese people or journalists and media or scholars to face up the loss of the war. Maybe I need to conclude here. It becoming too long. No?
Thank you for your profound contribution. Having worked with Holocaust survivors and for the last 5 or 6 decades, the impossibility of mourning is a total core issue. I believe it's a total core issue for World War I, World War II. And my God, I hope, and for Ukraine and for everything that's going on today. And in interaction with the conspiracy of silence, with not talking, with not opening the possibility individually, familially, community focus, national focus, international community to do the work of mourning. we may just repeat and repeat and repeat, which is a terrifying thought while we are speaking about the right of future generation. Let's go to the United States. I joined the war in response to Japan. Please, my fellow Americans, try to keep your time. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yael. I have a few notes. I'll probably refer to them, but just from the top of my head and my heart, we all know that the world was going through a Great Depression, which helped
Yes.
off these wars. That was true in my country, the USA. My father was one of 9 children on a farm in Depression era Minnesota. And as soon as he turned 18, I don't know if a visual would help here. Does anyone make out this photo?
Yeah.
There he was at age 18.
Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, he in following the footsteps of my grandfather, who served in World War I as what we called a doughboy, American soldier, headed off late into World War I. Again, America headed off late into World War II. But yeah, my grandfather never had anything good to say about the Germans. My father never had anything great to say about the Japanese. He served 42 months on a battleship in the Pacific with 8 days of leave in the middle, where they had to refit in Hawaii, but otherwise was at most of the major battles. He was heading for Alaska, the Aleutians, to prepare to invade the homeland from the north. And everyone thought in August of 1945 that the war was going to go on for another year until the dropping of the nuclear bombs. And we can devote much time to discussing the back and forths of that. But he told me he was happy. And he, along with his brothers who served in combat, excluding a few of their cousins who were killed in combat in Europe in World War II, we all came back to what became a booming economy. We quickly transitioned to the Cold War and carried on with our lives. All right. I did not serve. I kind of deviated from the family history, but took a course through college and graduate school and began work at the U.S. Veterans Administration medical system. And there I worked for 42 years. Is that a coincidence? My father's 42 months with my 40, I don't know. But from that perspective, along with others, I began to take on this new notion of PTSD. I started work at the VA in 1980, and the DSM had become the official guideline set or Bible of American psychiatry. And that, ironically, was triggered by Vietnam veterans who returned home in this climate of social unrest at the time of racial protests, women's rights, veterans' rights. And Yael knows well that many others contributed to the establishment of that diagnosis, both here and in the ICD. So everyone was focused on the Vietnam vets where I worked, except me. And I started taking a look back toward World War II and also the Korean conflict or war. And my, oh my, these people had been suffering in silence for decades and decades. The only people who knew how troubled they were their wives. And otherwise, no talking, conspiracy of silence. You can bring in all of those notions. But in the 1980s, we began to work with them, and the process was revelatory. I mean, for these 70 and 80-year-old men, by and large, who had served and suffered in silence all those years, there was a name or a set of descriptions that applied to them. And they began to open up. I ran POW groups, I ran combat veteran groups, I ran groups for wives. It was really, really rewarding to serve those folks at that time, even though it was not too late and too little. It was darn late, I must say. Let's see. These guys were grateful. They said, "Thank you, Vietnam vets, for not going silent and for protesting." I will close with a couple of observations from my years. It is this business of remembrance, okay? I had a very revered advisor who was born and raised in the Philippines and lived through the Japanese occupation and could never sit still or stay in the room with anyone of Japanese descent. That was his issue. He and I spoke, and he talked about those years as a teenager under Japanese occupation. And I said, "Well, doctor, I've just been on my second trip to the USSR. This was 1986, 1988, and you couldn't go to a city in the USSR without being dragged to a war memorial where they, I think perhaps overdid it a little bit." But my advisor just said, "Well, in the Philippines, we have no memory. We have no memory of World War II. We don't want to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it. And that's just how it is." So there are a variety of ways in which memory of World War II or lack thereof occurs over time, but I'm hoping that this panel and our speakers here today can help maintain, renew, revive awareness of World War II. I'll close with an almost funny anecdote. I had the privilege to deliver a presentation at Moscow State University about my work with PTSD and brain imaging and combat veterans and whatever. And I happened to mention prisoners of war in front of a Russian audience of scholars, okay? Mainly psychiatrists. And afterwards, they came up to me and said, "What is this prisoner of war thing you're talking about?" And I said, "What? What? And well, I had to go back to my history books and put on my thinking cap. But under Stalin's rule, POWs were either murdered or sent off to the Gulag. So no awareness of that in Russia these days, but hopefully in other countries, we can promote that and maintain that. With that, I'll close.
Thank you. I remember when we started working, indeed, when I was working on my papers on aging survivors of the Holocaust. That's how we met. I don't know about all of you, but it's quite profoundly amazing to see how personal World War II is to all of us. Ever since we decided to do this webinar, that is what struck me. I'm talking to friends who I knew for many years. hello, friends, for many years. Where has this discussion been? So it's quite amazing. It needs a lot of thinking. But let's move on. You will get moved some more now. I promise you. Harold, please go ahead.
I will. Thank you, Yael. And I'm just impressed by the historical perspective. Psychiatry, I think, has become very ahistorical as we've become very biological over the last few decades. I know that many of you on the panel for years, and I know that you're all very interested in the historical perspective. What I'm going to present is a kind of psychoanalytic reverie on the theme inspired by the invitation. Psychoanalysts study history because it's just part of our training in psychoanalysis. I can offer this. So a couple of months ago, my wife and I were going on a tour of Morocco. And when airport delays threatened our departure to Casablanca, Morocco, it looked like we weren't going to get there for at least an extra day or so. I was really surprised by my sense of urgency about getting there on time. It was just really a sort of a vacation after all, but looking back, I began to wonder if this had to do with my grandfather's service in the World War II invasion of North Africa, which took him to Casablanca in 1942. In fact, it was well, let me just keep going. Harold Sachs, MD, was a 41-year-old family doctor in Brooklyn, New York, when he joined the Army Medical Corps just after Pearl Harbor. He was 42 when he landed in Morocco as part of the first American offensive of the war. And he was about to turn 43 when he died of a coronary thrombosis after a series of heart attacks, which began during his military service. And I just got a few, if Robbie can cue those pictures, and we'll go through them very quickly. Yeah, these are from my grandfather's scrapbook. It occurred to me that this image is probably French warships in the harbor of Casablanca at around the time of the invasion. Next slide. This is always a picture which my grandfather apparently took from one of the terraces on a main street of Casablanca where he was stationed of American troops on parade. Next slide. This is a picture of a few years before the war. This is my grandfather to my far right, my mother sitting on the examination table, and his nurse Greta, who was also a close family friend in their office in Brooklyn. My grandmother lived above this office when I was a kid. Let's keep going. One more. Yeah, and this is my grandfather. This is, you may see the family resemblance of a very weak chin and chubbiness, a tendency toward chubbiness. But this is my grandfather while he was serving in Casablanca. All right, well, let's end those. My mother was a little older. She was 12 when her father died. And I was born 9 years later, and she named me after him. I was her first son. She was also determined that along with his name, I would take on his profession. I didn't have much choice of career. Although I wasn't sure I was going to get into medical school, I managed to do that. I was teased on the silver bracelet that my grandfather brought home for my grandmother. He had bought it in the Moroccan Medina. And as I grew, I was given his stethoscope to play with and later his microscope to experiment with. Now, as I sat in the airport and the airline text delay after delay, it struck me that as frustrating as this was for me, it was still a lot easier for me to get to Casablanca than it had been for my grandfather. That invasion force was the largest armada ever to sail until D-Day eclipsed it. But the hospital ship that he served on was actually sunk during the invasion. My next thought sitting in the airport was, am I completing an arc of my own by taking this trip at age 71? And I'll add that my middle name is from my mother's uncle, who died somewhere in Germany, I think it was probably near Wiesbaden, exactly 8 years to the day before I was born. And he was an Army medic. He and his crew died together when their ambulance ran over a landmine. And they were actually on their way to help a German woman who apparently was in a difficult labor. I don't know if the German woman was on the ambulance when it was blown, as my grandmother said, to smithereens, a phrase that has haunted me since my early childhood. I'll add that, well, having been named after two members of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, both of whom died in World War II, it doesn't really require a psychoanalytic background to understand core reasons why my entire career has been spent as a psychiatrist and mental health policymaker in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, or why I wanted to be a part of this webinar. One way or another, my feelings about traveling to Casablanca reaffirm my longstanding belief that the most important decision in my life was made years before I was born by men who died in World War II, and whose names and mission I try to carry on. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Harold. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yael. So, and now for something totally different, because I'm the international lawyer of the group. So I think my presentation is very different. But my personal connection is that my mother survived the war in Vienna in hiding, and most of her family did not. The family from northern Czechoslovakia ended up in Auschwitz. That was the family she grew up with. And then I really related to that Broadway show, Leopoldstadt, about this big Viennese family. And well, I don't mourn this big Viennese family because I never knew them all, but they're all gone. And most of them did not meet normal deaths. I think one made it out to England before the war because she had a Nazi boyfriend who got her papers and got her out because he said horrible things are coming. And my great aunt Jenny survived in England. And another was running people through the mountains of Switzerland and never made it back. So was presumably caught and shot. But most of the family didn't make it, but luckily enough did that I am here today. You know, I don't think I consciously think it's why I deal with atrocity prevention and aggression, crimes, etc. But it's obviously somewhere there in my DNA. So I thought I would talk a little bit about, you know, international law responding to these horrific events and what we can do from the perspective of an international lawyer. And I do say international law responds because, you know, it's after the trench warfare of World War I that we get early conventions on biological weapons. So horrific things happen and the law responds. And it would be nice if the law were forward thinking, but it seems not to be. It seems just to respond to horrible atrocities. So after World War II, we see responses in various ways: efforts to prevent war, efforts to ameliorate abuses in war, and of course, addressing attempted extermination of an entire group, which is the word you will know, genocide. We also have the growth of a whole human rights movement. So, you know, after World War II, I think there's a sense, okay, the law has really failed us and we need to do much better. And Raphael Lemkin, of course, coined the term genocide, genos cedere, killing of a genos, killing of an entire group. Genocide wasn't prosecuted at Nuremberg, so that, you know, most people would think, oh, wasn't that what Nuremberg was all about? No, it wasn't. His focus was, we need this thing called the Genocide Convention. And he worked for decades to get that passed. It was 1948, so I guess not decades there, but then decades to get countries to join that. So we need the law, but our second step is, unfortunately, we need it implemented. So, you know, we have the Genocide Convention, and of course, we have seen genocides in Rwanda, Srebrenica, against the Kurds, the Yazidis, the Rohingya, the Uyghurs in China. We have a long way to go. So we're still, you know, need to work on implementation. I've written a book, Existing Legal Limits to Security Council Veto Power. And that is challenging the legality of some of the vetoes cast. And I argue we need to take this case to the International Court of Justice. I think if we pursued that, we might be able to rein in some of the abusive vetoes that have prevented the Security Council when it had a plan to act. Now, sometimes it just, like Rwanda, is like, yeah, we're not going to do anything. So it wouldn't solve that. But when there is a plan and then a permanent member blocks it, I think there's some legal challenges. So there are things we can do in international law. So that's a tiny bit, and I'm happy to discuss more on the Genocide Convention. Then also recognizing, well, there will be war, unfortunately. I mean, first we try to prevent war, which is in the UN Charter, but if there is war, can we mitigate some of the more horrific aspects? And this starts already in the late 1800s. But after World War II, we see the 4 1949 Geneva Conventions updated now with additional protocols 1 and 2. And this may seem, counterintuitive, how to, laws to govern war, and it creates these horrible things like, yes, kill combatants, but not non-combatants. Well, in the law of war framework, that makes sense because that is the point of war, killing combatants, but you don't advance your war objectives by killing non-combatants. So it sets these kind of foundational principles. And then horrible euphemisms like collateral damage. Okay, if you have a military target, you could kill this many civilians around it if it's proportionate to your military advantage. Is it good enough? We have the law. No, it isn't good enough. We now need the law to be implemented. There are conflicts around the globe. One in particular I'm thinking of where I don't think the law of war is being observed. When we see starvation used as a weapon of war. Well, that takes us back to like siege warfare of the medieval ages, Middle Ages. Using food as a weapon of war is a war crime, intentional infliction of starvation. We need more enforcement of our laws. Third, and I think maybe for me and in my work, the most important is the attempt to rein in aggressive war. And our greatest document trying to do this is the UN Charter, because it says there can only be war in self-defense and if authorized by the Security Council. If only, we would adhere to the UN Charter. So we have the law. What we again need is enforcement. So some enforcement is blocked by the veto. So when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was a draft resolution to condemn Russia's aggression and impose a lot of other measures, Russia simply vetoed it. So I think we're seeing abusive vetoes, and these could be tackled in a variety of ways. The other thing we try to do, and this springs out of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, is prosecute the crime of aggression. But we're having challenges in this front. This is an area I was privileged with Yael to get to work with Benjamin Ferencz, who was the last US Nuremberg prosecutor, and having prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen case at Nuremberg in one of the subsequent trials. And he had also gathered evidence of Nazi atrocities at the end of the war, traveled through Europe gathering, horrific evidence. He always used to say, when I had evidence of 1 million killings by the SS mobile execution squads, I stopped gathering evidence. It was enough of a case. So Ben was a champion of the crime of aggression and enforcement. And this is something we really, I think, need to further Ben's legacy. There are 2 routes a number of us have been pursuing. We always knew it was a problem, but maybe Russia's invasion reminded us, like if you don't have the aggression, you don't have all of the other crimes that flow. Not that only Russian aggression counts, but it's a reminder of why we really need to do this. So 2 steps have been pursued. One has been trying to create a special tribunal on the crime of aggression for the situation, and that is being created through the Council of Europe, although it is, in my mind, I'm rather ambivalent. It does have immunity for Putin and the Troika, the top 3 highest officials. So I feel very conflicted about what they were able to negotiate. And the other challenge we have is we're trying to create more jurisdiction before the International Criminal Court to prosecute the crime of aggression. And we're going to have a review on that this year. Unfortunately, some of our powerful states want to block this. So the more powerful states, they have their militaries, and they don't want this pesky thing called the crime of aggression, because maybe they want to invade Iraq or something, and the legal theory isn't really there, and they don't want us lawyers pointing this out. And smaller countries are much more in favor. They fear being invaded, and even not so small, Ukraine and Poland, have stood strong in favor of prosecution of the crime. So it's any country that might see itself as a victim of the crime of aggression, I think, needs to step up to the plate in these negotiations. So international law responds to horrible atrocities, but unfortunately we need both the law and then we need to be able to utilize it. And we're really working, I think, still in both fronts, more law, and so that we can, harness the rule of law and have more global enforcement. And it is still a work in progress. And, it's with sadness that the 4 allies that created the Nuremberg Tribunal, including the US, have really opposed our progress in this field, for fear that they sometime might want to commit an aggressive war, because self-defense is allowed, authorized Security Council interventions are allowed, but they don't find that enough. So it's quite a contentious area, but I think it's so very important. And Ben used to say, in terms of improving the law, never give up, never give up, never give up. He always said it 3 times, that we need to try to fix the law in this area. So I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. And yeah, I suppose, from the rest of the panel's point of view, law and justice is part of healing and prevention. So we are not really so far apart as one would disciplinarily think. That has been my approach always. Everybody tries to do their best to heal from horrible realities. Thank you, Eric, for putting in the chat the film. According to our timeline, we have 5 minutes. Now, I don't mind staying further. I don't think anybody would mind. So if you can really limit yourselves to what you found most striking. We can also have another option, which is to have this panel meet again for discussion and for reflections on our discussion. This is totally possible. So think about that. And it's certainly worthy of doing. And there's so much rich intellectual and emotional and soul and mind contribution here.
Can I just share, Yael, just in 30 seconds or maybe 20 or 10? I really enjoy this, having all these friends, colleagues, these emotional testimonials. It's a rare opportunity to hear all these various contributions from Japan, Australia, US, UK. And as somebody in the chat said, these are emotional testimonials. We all have fathers and mothers, and we carry the legacy of their stories, their narratives, either by our names or our profession and how we are incentivized to do the work we're doing. So this is beyond academic scholarly work. This is so it's very rich. Well, it's very rich. So I really enjoyed the subtleties and the and as Harold said, this needs to embed it in psychiatry, because psychiatry is ahistorical. And I think by doing this, we see where psychiatry comes from and where it may go to. And Volodymyr said that so beautifully. I mean, they're the only ones that are in a war, right? We're all in various countries, I feel, that are relatively in peace, but Volodymyr is in a country that is at war. So for him, it is completely a different story. I was at Maidan Square just 2 weeks, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, and looking at the Maidan Square where all the remembrances are being given by the leaders. It's okay. So I'll stop there because just wanted to echo how I value this this event that you organized. Kudos to you, Yael.
Okay, wonderful. Simon, I see you feel okay about meeting again. I think that Anna, I see you are writing here. And this is from our interpreter. How do you like that? So here we go. This has been helpful to all. Within how long would you think we should do it? Within a week, 2 weeks, a month?
I think it'll be difficult to get everyone together in just 2 weeks' time because I think all of us are pretty busy. So okay. It might take a bit longer. But
if everybody willing.
I mean, I personally would like to do that because I think it's a little bit too easy just to say, no one ever talks about this, etc. I think it's much more complicated and nuanced than that, and I think needs, particularly given the participants here are all, brilliant and sophisticated thinkers and speakers. And I would like to hear much more on that actually, because I think it is much. I think we'd all agree it's more complicated than that.
Well, in 2 weeks today in the United States will be Memorial Day, which has quite a story behind it. And it would be a fitting day, and a lot of us who have jobs in the US would be free to be at this meeting.
It would be free.
Oh, Harold.
Okay, that is okay. We did it. It's done. Fantastic. Let me. So let's leave the questions in place. Volodymyr, I think there is one question just to you. If you would please check it out. Oh, it disappeared.
Well, it said, how did he manage to declassify the KGB archives? So very important. I see that in the questions.
This is a question to your heroism, Volodymyr. So let's not take it now. Let's do it in 2 weeks because that's a whole other attempt at healing history, isn't it?
Знаєте, це справді би потребувало.
That would really require a separate meeting, a separate lecture. It was demanding and interesting work, and Russia was opposing that initiative. But regarding the items that we would need to discuss, I believe one of interesting questions as a result of our discussion, well, being a historian, I know that our historians, we believe that when we speak about atrocities and horrors of the Second World War, we kind of prevent that from happening further on. The more we speak about World War II, the more peacefully we implement the slogan, never again. Unfortunately, I'm now speaking from Ukraine where never again just failed.
Exactly.
We knew about the Second World War and everyone knew that. So, but now it comes again. So it would be interesting to discuss why humanity has lost the fear of the war, why people believe that the war is important. And it's not just about Ukraine, the situation between India and Pakistan and in other regions. So is it possible that humankind has lost immunity to the war, that it was so hard to gain after the Second World War? I believe it's an interesting theme for the future.
Absolutely. But let's meet in 2 weeks, same time. We don't need a rehearsal. You're now getting to know each other a bit. You can listen. You will receive the recording within the hour. You can re-listen to yourself and to each other, take notes. How about if I, in part, imparting today, I just read you two survivors, wise, Holocaust survivors' wise words. Is that okay with you? So let me begin with Elie Wiesel. He wrote 30 years after the war in 1975 about the consequences to the survivors of the conspiracy of silence, 25 years after World War II. And Elie said, at the risk of offending, it must be emphasized that the victim suffered more and more profoundly from the indifference of the onlookers than from the brutality of the executioner. The cruelty of the enemy would have been incapable of breaking the prisoner. It was the silence of those he believed to be his friends, cruelty more cowardly, more subtle, which broke his heart. There was no longer anyone on whom to count. It poisoned the desire to live. If this is the human society we come from and are now abandoned by, why seek to return? And let me add one more. And let me just say that Bruno Bettelheim observed separately, what cannot be talked about can also not be put to rest. And if it is not, the wounds continue to fester from generation to generation. I will put it all in the chat so you'll have it, or I will send it to you. But let me read the very last one. Isabella Leitner, a survivor, who spoke about the genuine impossibility of mourning. The sun made a desperate effort to shine on the last day of May in 1944. The sun is warm in May, it heals, but even the heavens were helpless on that day. A force so evil ruled heaven and earth that it altered the natural order of the universe. And the heart of my mother was floating in the smoke-filled sky of Auschwitz. I have tried to rub the smoke out of my vision for 40 years now. But my eyes are still burning, Mother. Later, when she was already in the United States, she wrote, I search the sky in desperate sorrow, but can discern no human form. There is not a trace, no grave, nothing, absolutely nothing. My mother lived for just a while, Potio for less than 14 years. In a way, they did not really die. They simply became smoke. How does one bury smoke? How does one place headstones in the sky? How does one bring flowers to the clouds? Mother, Potio, I am trying to say goodbye to you. I am trying to say goodbye. I thought I would leave you with this. And we continue to, I'll have to find it to put it in the chat, or I will just send it to all of you with your permission. Okay. I don't want another technical ridiculousness. I can't thank you enough. Unsurprisingly to me, this has been a most profound discussion. And perhaps because we are both human beings and professionals, or behind every professional, there's a human being. So, so let's with history. So we are meeting in 2 weeks. Any last words, anybody, right now? The floor is yours. Let's leave it for 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Simon,
Well done.
I have a quick
Well
question
done.
for you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Simon?
Thank you all.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Did you ever meet an American named Irv Gottesman?
Yes, schizophrenia guy.
He he described you as his mentor, and I
No,
described
he didn't.
I
couldn't have done.
I described him as my mentor, so I am your intellectual grandson. Thank you.
no, Irv was a major figure when I was growing up, mate. Oh, well, that's nice to know. Thank you.